My name is John Cornicello, and I welcome you to my series of interactive photo conversations. You can check out the schedule at cornicello.com/conversations for dates and times of upcoming shows. Coming up, we have Julie Corcoran, Harold Davis, Roman Lawrence, and Paul and John Paul Caponegro. I want to mention my book, Anatomy of a Studio Portrait, is available in print via Amazon or a PDF from Photo. I'll put a link to those in the description of the recording when it gets posted. Next, you look change of the look here. My friends at Intervit Photos sent me their new Badger Beam LED light, and I'm using that now for the show. But let's go with my guest today is Pratik Naik. Pratik is a high-end beauty retoucher and owner of Solstice Retouching. So let's wish a happy solstice to and welcome Pratik to the show.
That was perfect. Great introduction, John.
Thanks. I didn't realize when we set this up that it was solstice, and your company is Solstice Retouching.
I'll be honest, as much as I want to take credit for that being intentional, totally accidental.
Good. At least we're honest about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't even realize it was solstice today, actually.
Yep, winter solstice.
Perfect.
Shortest day of the year.
More importantly, it's also my wife's birthday.
Oh,
Oh,
makes it very easy to remember.
yeah.
That's why you married her.
For calendaring purposes.
So, Pratik, you also do photography. So, are you a photographer who retouches or a retoucher who photographs?
Yes.
So interestingly, I would consider myself a retoucher who photographs.
Mhm.
And the reason for that is I think I ended up learning a lot of what I know from osmosis pretty much, just because being able to see what my clients are producing on the raw files and the limitations that they have versus what they can't do. I think I learned more that way than when I was shooting. So I think I would consider myself a retoucher who photographs more than the other way around.
But being you do both, what can photographers do to help themselves and help you when they know an image is going to be retouched? Is there things to do with lighting or just anything? What are some of your tips for photographers who want to make it easier for the retoucher?
Absolutely. And as a retoucher, I think we get a really good idea of what's possible with the files, especially when we're asked to do things that are not physically possible. We end up learning quite a bit from that. Number one is the lighting, definitely. You really have a limitation as to how much you can actually fix the lighting in post. So we always tell people that, make sure that's done properly. Otherwise, it's going to be something that is a problem. We have to know specifically how much you want us to modify it versus not modify it. And if so, we need to know beforehand if you're even looking to recover information, because before we were accustomed to not modifying the raw files at all, because we knew the latitude of those files in terms of lighting was very limited. And when you pushed beyond ISO 100, there was a lot of grain and noise. These days with the raw files, you have a lot more latitude, so things are more possible to recover. But before, it wasn't really possible. So I always tell people, even if you can really get that lighting down, whether it's how soft or hard it is, the placement and direction, because it's quite common where people do ask, could you recover these details, or could you add more exposure to these parts realistically, or could you add more highlights in an area where there isn't any highlights whatsoever. And so those are the things that we often discuss, especially with like look or feel. And that also stems into color grading, where the lighting can impact the potential of the color grade. So that's something that I always tell people off the bat.
What about people using gels? I've had some some retouchers rather, say, leave the gels off and let me put the color in later for you.
I would highly not recommend that, just because the placement of the way the light falls with the gels definitely is very, very difficult to recreate. And it's much more difficult to do that way, and not as realistic, because how the skin renders when a gel is placed on the skin is not the same when you do it in Photoshop, where you overlay a color. The way the color reacts is entirely different, especially like to the sensor. So if you're going to do gels, definitely do it in real life rather than in post.
Yeah. So, Joe, you had started before we started today talking about some of the things you saw on Pratik's website. Did you have some comments you wanted to make?
Just my first reaction to it was it created such a there's there is such a strong cohesive set of work, and it's to me it is very cinematic, but it just feels super intentional in a way that I really like. I mean, it seems like can take these photos exactly where at least it looks like it, looking from the outside in. Like there's a destination in mind, and you can really get there, which is it's exciting to see, I guess.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. And it's interesting because with the color grade themselves, we often have that discussion beforehand, especially where we want to take it to. And the thing with color is that when you look at the photos, and in fact, let me go ahead and do a screen share if it lets me do it.
Yep.
Let me
You
go
should
ahead and
be able to.
Okay, here we go. Share screen. Okay. So let me go to the top here for a second. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at these photographs, especially this first part here, you imagine that there's a lot of color grade happening. But in reality, this particular set, this beauty set we have here, there wasn't a lot of color grade going on. And people always wonder, well, how is that really possible? And this particular set, if you notice, and this is going to be a good example going forward for the rest of the images, where the color palette within the frame, within the files themselves, were pretty close to the end result. And it's because the color palette that they use for the makeup, um, the lighting and the skin tones, the clothes, they all had a very beige color palette. And that ends up lending to the way the overall picture looks. So often the color grading begins with the choices we make with the wardrobe and how the lighting is interpreting that color as well. And of course, also using things like Capture One versus Camera Raw or the lighting choices you make, again, because this being a hard light setup in comparison to, a traditional like softbox kind of style, also render a different result and look. So this was actually pretty close to being on camera. And let's go to something else like this one. Now, this was shot by my friend Lara Jade, and we did color grade this one a little bit more extensively. But also the same principles applied with these images, where the color palette of the clothes themselves kept the entire color scheme within that, beige, yellowish, muted tones. And where you'll notice that is true is with this image here on the left, where there's more of like a light purple color happening, which is breaking up that symmetrical color palette. So we always consider that even before we do any of the color grading itself. This is another example here, which contrasts perfectly to the previous set, where there's more of a overall blue scheme or a colder scheme. And here the same thing goes on where the actual wardrobe itself was a lot cooler. And this was also intentional because now her skin tones really stand out a lot more. The reds in her makeup stand out a lot more, and the golds in the clothing stand out a lot more. So, this was all something to consider. And I like mentioning that quite often because when people color grade and use references, even with the same color grade, which often isn't really intense, what happens is they're not able to get to the same destination, which is why things like presets and things like that are good, but you have to consider the source. You have to see the before and after and really think about, what are the preconditions before the color grading. And also, you also have to think about the dominance of shadows and highlights, of course, because with these, since there's a lot more shadows happening, the delicate balance of color is even more delicate because the more you inject color into the shadows, the easier it is to really stand out. Whereas, injecting color into the highlights doesn't stand out as much. So you have a lot more room to play when there's more contrast in an image, or when you have a lot more shadow dominance going on, where the blues here really, really stand out in comparison to the highlights, which are quite neutral in comparison. So that's such a fantastic observation, and I hope that was interesting as well.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So all of these images were pre-discussed based on the location?
Yes. So
Okay.
they had uh, they had the mood board initially, and basically they put the outfits together based on the location,
Mhm.
and then they ended up deciding, you know what, we're going to use these particular palettes with these particular locations, and then they brought it together accordingly. And a wardrobe
Oh,
stylist was used for all of these as well, so that way they had this idea in mind.
do they bring you into that discussion as an integral part of it?
Unfortunately, no. They end up making the decision on their end, and then once that's done and they actually do the shoot, they present everything to me, especially the direction they want to push it towards.
And then they
And
say, and then they say to you, you fix it. You make it better.
Fix it in post.
yeah.
Jim Breakers bringing up a similar question in the chat there. When a
Oh.
photographer or art director comes to you, how can they best communicate their needs or intent? And Cheryl has a question too, and we'll come back to that.
I think the best way of communicating the needs and intention is providing visual imagery and saying, this is the mood board that I'm going for. Is there anything that I'm overlooking based on the shoot that we have going on? And with that in mind, we're able to also provide feedback just based on the clients that we worked with and understanding the process of what we are given, so we can have a good example of what's needed. And also from trial and error, because honestly, you know, no matter how much you end up sometimes looking at tutorials or looking online or reading about it, you have to sometimes just fail at it. You have to go and see, oh, what's not working and why is it not working? And then next time ends up improving. So sometimes there's no way around it. You know, you could try and definitely keep these things in mind, but at the end, you know, if there's some things that don't work, you know, it's best not to force it. Because I've seen that happen as well, where there might be a gap that's so large in between the mood board and what they shot, where it's not able to be bridged. So, and then we end up breaking down why it's not able to be bridged, whether it's, you know, the color palette they use was completely different and contrasting, or maybe the clothes they use was the problem. Because I see that happen a lot as well, where the shots themselves are really great, but the decisions of the clothing really break up the color palette patterns of the photo, where it just is not cohesive whatsoever.
One more. Are you allowed
Mhm.
to play with the colors of the clothing,
Mhm.
or do they say stay away from the clothing and just work around the scene
Mhm.
to augment the clothing that's there?
That's a fantastic question. I'm really glad you brought that up. Now, I have seen two different camps. One camp is where they don't mind the creative play with the color palette, and that comes down to two factors. Number one is going to be the designer themselves. If they want a more creative approach to the color grading, then it serves as a good purpose to do so. However, there are some designers that actually prefer not to modify the clothing. So what happens is, in a commercial setting, for example, where if this is going to be published in an ad, and they don't want any tweaks to be done to the color, but they still want a stylistic effect, we might actually do a light color grade overall for the global color grade, but then within the clothes themselves, we might mask out particular tops or particular garments, especially if they want that represented more accurately. And of course, for like lookbooks, they don't color grade that much at all either. And so it goes both ways. And it depends on who we're working with and where it's going to end up. For editorial purposes, like these particular images, you could see that the color grade actually is injected into the clothes as well. We didn't have to do much masking at all for them, which was very good, because now we don't have to spend time masking, which is great, but also B, um, it ends up being a little bit more fun and playful. And I prefer to have a color grade overall, even though it skews the realism, just because it plays into the fantasy aspect, and a lot of fashion, especially for selling purposes, is fantasy based. It's imagining yourself in that location, or it's imagining yourself in it. And if there's any break in that fantasy, it detracts from potentially selling that piece of garment because it looks too realistic, perhaps. So that was a great question.
Cool. So Cheryl is asking about frequency separation.
Mhm.
Some use it, some don't. I don't know if you do or not. But in the final output, if it's large, like a 24 by 36 print, can you tell if frequency separation was used? Will it degrade the quality of the print?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's a very we're gonna be here for an hour, folks. Let's just sit in here and talk about it. But frequency separation, let me backtrack here for those of you who might not be aware, or if anybody's tuning in that is relatively newer to photography or retouching, I would say. Frequency separation is something that is a term used as a retouching technique. It's not um, harmonious for using it to describe retouching as a whole, because it is one technique in an arsenal of techniques that we use as retouchers. And we personally, I started retouching, I think around 15 years ago now. And back then we primarily just did dodge and burn and heal and clone for our workflow method. So we'd start by cleaning up the skin a little bit. Let me click over to the before and after section here on my website so you get a better visual example of what I'm talking about. Now, whenever anybody has time, you can go to my website and see this video here on my before and after section, which is a actual time lapse of my actual retouching workflow, even to this day, where I show people kind of how I keep extremely realistic results, but handcraft them manually. And I use dodge and burn and healing clone primarily as my methods. So as I mentioned before, I'll go over here to the before file, and it might not show up as clear on Zoom, but she has some skin issues here, some texture issues, some color issues, etc. So what I would end up doing is I would end up healing a lot of the skin first with the blemishes and some of the bumps and some of the texture with the clone brush. And then I would use dodge and burn, which is a technique we use since forever for evening out color. I'm sorry, evening out light in your midtones or your shadows and your highlights. And you can also use it to amplify highlight detail or shadow detail. So you could do it locally, which is at a pore level or at a really smaller area, or you could do it globally, which is done across you know, different tonal ranges. So what I particularly like using dodge and burn for is any blotchy skin that happens, especially when you see darker lines and darker bits on the skin, we can dodge that out and even that out. So what happens is we actually retain the original skin texture without disturbing any of the surrounding skin texture. So it blends in very realistically. And what I like about that is at a very small pore level with dodge and burn, you end up keeping some variation of light and shadow, which keeps the realism there. Now, frequency separation is a technique where you end up splitting the texture from the color, so that what happens is whenever you want to, say, modify the color, you end up evening out even the light issues. So for example, over here, where there's a blotchy skin and you see some of the darker parts, when you do frequency separation, effectively, these blotchy color bits are placed into the low frequency layer, which is the bottom layer. And because of it, you can use a brush tool or a mixer brush tool to even out those colors. And with that, the color gets evened out, but also the luminosity, because color in fact is also part luminosity. So what happens is, for example, if I put this in frequency separation and start brushing, this whole area becomes um, a similar color and tone. And although that sounds good, what happens is you sometimes end up losing the humanity to the skin because you easily change up and modify the natural contours of the face. You change the anatomy of somebody because it's really hard to control that. Unless you're a realistic painter or have background in art, doing that manually can override a lot of the realism. And light also is very nuanced, where if you look at her nose, for example, she has different light patterns across her nose that give you an idea of what her nose shape is. if you took a brush and tried to brush that out to even out the color and light, what you also do is change the shape of the nose, and you change the shape of the anatomy to the point where it starts to have this uncanny valley effect where you look at it, and even though the texture is not touched at all because it's on a separate layer, you change it enough where it just doesn't look human. And for me personally, I prefer dodging and burning because I could keep those details to the point where I decide what is there and what isn't. And I'll be honest, dodging and burning is a lot harder than doing frequency separation. And frequency separation is a lot faster, but you have the compromise of sometimes evening out things too much. So what I tell people is that even in my personal workflow, after the dodge and burn is done, or to the best of my abilities, I use frequency separation sparingly so that anything that is left over from the dodge and burn, which is still blotchy, perhaps if you might not have as much experience, or it might be taking too long, it's not as detrimental when you combine that with frequency separation. But if I was going to be telling people to use frequency separation from the get-go, if it was something very important like a large print, or if you're entering a competition, it can be very noticeable, especially when you compare it to somebody who is doing it by hand or has the control at a poor level detail. So and there's not a right or wrong answer, because people can use frequency separation and it can be adopted as their style. I have seen that in, like the beauty industry or for fine art portraiture, where people will use frequency separation. And because, they are good at painting, or they have a particular style of their work, it ends up integrating into their modern style of what their work is like. So it's a creative approach. It's a creative decision. It's also good to understand both techniques, so that you're able to pick and choose and decide when to use what for their best purposes. It can also be good for things like architecture or product, where frequency separation, because it keeps the texture on top and you don't have a lot of nuanced anatomy, it's easier to even out colors that way. Or like using, for example, walls, where you want to even out colors underneath and in between the texture patterns of the wall. That could be a lot, it can be very convenient and much more powerful than doing it by hand. So it's always good to look at both sides and discuss those.
That kind of brings us to Steve's question. Stephen Gotts is asking if there's different considerations between retouching for fashion or retouching for portraits.
Yes, absolutely. So portraits, what I've found personally is that I have a retouching class on the Portrait Masters, which is called the Retouching series. And I primarily worked with portrait photographers to develop that curriculum. And what was interesting to me was when I came into that position, I came from a fashion and beauty background. So as you see here, this can be construed as both a beauty or a portrait, depending on the end result. And this was a Scandinavian photographer who was of a notion that, skin should be left as skin. And even their beauty campaigns often keep a lot of realism in their work, which is why I really love, teaching out in Denmark and Sweden and places like that, because they have a different aesthetic and understanding of what beauty should be versus, say, going to Taiwan or Asia, where their standards are different. And so the demographic also changes the definition of beauty. And so for me, I think the definition of beauty isn't so much the techniques used or the end result you associate with, but it's also the intention of where the file ends up and the purpose of it. So for this one, the purpose of it was the makeup, showing off the natural makeup of the model and also the lips, and also showing off the jewelry. And that's typically how beauty images are composed. Portraits are typically not even composed this way, because portraits are more about, you see more of the person, their personality, and so forth. So that's also a consideration. So when I talk about the difference in retouching between, say, fashion and portraits, it's also the end result, the intention of where it's going to go. But also with portraits, we end up keeping a lot more personality and character of the person. Let's say, for example, this person had a lot more beauty marks. Maybe she had freckles, maybe she had a mole, maybe she had something that identifies with her. We wouldn't actually take that out because it is something that is a part of her unless requested. And obviously times change, and based on social standards, or maybe they're using it for a headshot that is in a different industry where looks are more imperative than others, we get different requests. So portraits typically keep a lot more a nuanced a look, or sometimes they take a lot more work because we want them to look as if they're not retouched, which requires a lot more work done by hand, whether that's evening out colors, color casts, whether that's, maybe they don't have blood flow to certain parts of their face or neck that we want to bring back to normal, where you don't notice it as much. Maybe there's a lot more redness. So we have to take a more surgical approach to portraits. Whereas with beauty, you can definitely tell there's more of a heavy-handed approach, because it's almost like traversing over a flatter plane where there's not many barriers if you want to go the distance. So with portraits, it might look like there's a lot less work done, but sometimes there's a lot more work done, but done more diligently.
So Joe is asking, is it sometimes a challenge to manage the amount of time required to achieve the results you want? How do you balance the time you need with the time you have?
I think that the answer is deadlines. I remember there was a time before I began, and I started my retouching career 10 years ago. And around then, I still wasn't 100% confident in my work. So I was constantly guessing myself and guessing whether or not this was good enough for the client. And I had the luxury at the time to provide images after spending more time than I should have, because I wasn't factoring in cost as much as I should have, and profits. And so whenever I would spend more time on the files thinking it was what they wanted, I would often get feedback saying, could you take it down a notch? Could you pull back a little bit? Because reality is, we as retouchers often have to produce results that can fit within the client's portfolio. So sometimes that means not always going and pushing to the standards that I would particularly be used to for everything, but analyzing the client's work and saying, these are the things that they would keep. It's not necessary to go this far because they need to fit within their portfolio and make it look like it's part of their work. So I would say it comes from experience as well, and time. It's just like photography. How do you know that you got the shot? Sometimes what happens is you spend all this time in studio shooting away and hoping and praying you got the photo. So you spray and pray a lot, and then you come back and say, well, I hope one of these are the photos. But then with a seasoned professional, they don't shoot as much because sometimes they know when they got the shot. And the same thing happens with retouching. You end up retouching a photo for a long enough period of time where you realize, now I think this is the place that I need to stop. And it comes from, I'll be honest, personal experience and trusting your instinct. And if your instinct says it's too much, especially when you come back the next day, then it's important to pull back a little bit.
Do you think that a lot of this has to do with trust from your client, and trust in you?
Yes.
And the designer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's funny. There's a good balance between the trust that I'm placed as a retoucher and also the notes that I get. More often than not, you'd think because I'm able to showcase and demonstrate some competency that there would be a lot more trust that goes into place, where they would simply say, retouch the images and then let's see what happens. But what happens is, funny enough, even though they trust me, they still will have a large set of notes into what specifically they would like done. And I think before I was kind of offended by that, thinking, wow, I can't believe they don't trust me in my decisions that I'm going to make with all the experience that I have. And oh, I'm so awesome, whatever. But the reality was that these notes were so that it saved us all time, where we weren't retouching and guessing what wasn't necessary. And then also telling me specifically that this was the look that we are going for. And we trust you to execute these specific things in a way that no one else can do as well. So the notes were a sign of respect at the end of the day, that they trusted me that I could do that. So I thought that without getting any notes that it wasn't a sign of trust, but it was something that I highly valued at the end.
Very well put. Very, very well put.
Thank you so much.
So Paul is asking, oh, go ahead, Ian, and then I'll...
I just ran across your infinite color panel, and I was going to ask you about that. And also, is that the tools that you use to create the color grading, like in Pink Motel or in the blue series of photographs just before it?
Fantastic question. I'm going to do a screen share just one more time again, and I'm going to show you what he was referring to in regards to the Pink Motel shoot. That was a very, believe it or not, that shoot ended up being one of the most requested shoots that I got questions on with the color grading. And I'll talk about infinite color and how that plays into that as well. And I'll explain that in a minute. But this is the Pink Motel shoot that we were referencing here. And this was such an interesting shoot because this was a very good example of the communication that happened before we started retouching. So the photographer, Eric Michael Roy, and he's a very good commercial photographer, and he has a very specific vision in mind. And this Pink Motel was actually pink. It was definitely pink, that was for sure. And many of you have probably seen this by now or potentially even been there. But there's a couple of things that were not there in real life. And there's some elements of this shoot that didn't exist. Number one, it was the blue part in the background with the wall is, or the pink accents of the window frame, or the pink window shades. And also, you'll notice that the color grading on the model is not the same as the rest of the photograph. So this was done in two parts. The photographer sent over a mood board of the shoot itself, where the overall color grade looks similar, where you saw blues in the shadows and you saw very warm, kind of neutral highlights. And you'll notice the highlights if you look at the ground here, and if you look at the pavement here in the midtones, we start seeing even the midtones a little bit more purple and blue, and it transitions into kind of beigeish highlights if you look across the image. And the other thing about this was we did two parts. We did the overall color grade, and then we did selective color grading. And by selective color grading, I mean, for example, we selected the sky, and then we color graded the sky and masked it out individually. And then we selected the pinks specifically, and then color graded the pinks so that they were much more similar to each other. And this came down to the photographer's input, where he said, this is the color palette I want for the sky. This is the pink tones I would like for the car and the other pink elements. And then we'd play accordingly. And I even remember also masking out the shirt and also color grading it that way. Let me go back to the other one. And the same thing happened for the dress. Here, the stylist actually didn't want a ton of color grading to happen within the dress, but we still needed some of it to seep through so that it merged more cohesively. So I ended up masking the garments as well so that I could infuse the color grade, but not at 100%. So we ended up actually doing everything independently, especially the skin tones, the background. And you notice here more obviously is that the pinks now are similar within the back over here where the sign was, and this sign wasn't even on. So we had to inject a little bit of pink and a little bit of luminosity into the sign. It was actually quite dark. And then we had to manually add blues into these back boards here and over here. And then we had to clean up the steps. And also we had to clean up the ground as well and darken it. So each of these elements were done independently to get the look that we were going for. But
do you remember how many different layers you had?
I don't remember actually, but I do know it was quite a lot. That's for sure. The other thing that wasn't obvious is we had power lines in the background and other elements that we had to mask out. And we had to change the gradient. And we had to change the gradient of the sky so that it actually went from dark to light, and work around and the trees and the cars and etc. and the signs. So these were all done independently. And with the pink jacket here as well, we did the pink jacket. And we did, what else did we do? And the gloves and the dress here as well, just to make sure that they were similar. And the subjects themselves did come with pieces that were close, but we had to get them a little bit more uniform with terms of saturation and luminosity. There were very specific values that he was kind of looking for, and it was all very intentional. And in relation to how this might work with infinite color panel or a color grading application, or say a preset, for example, I'll talk about infinite color panel for just a second as well. And I'll come back to this in case anybody has any questions going forward too. One of my businesses and something that kind of was very accidental was a few years ago, I ended up having this idea for the infinite color panel. And basically, this is a Photoshop application or plugin or an extension that works within Photoshop Creative Cloud, where people might not have an idea of what direction to go for color grading. But I had an idea that if I could somehow take the essence of the color grades that I use in my photographs and inject that into an application that everyone can utilize, what would be the easiest way to do so? And I thought of having just a big library of presets or actions or something like that, but it didn't seem personalized enough, and it seemed like it was too similar to things that were already on the market. And I needed something for me that would easily give me suggestions and save me time for potential coloring options. And I remember, and this was a very specific example because this was a job that I had to do and I had a deadline for, and it was for Joe McNally. And it was a few years ago. And me and Joe worked very closely for a lot of his work and his prints and in his digital work as well. And he would trust me to color grade the photographs. And he wanted me to give him a couple of different examples of an image that we had to present at WPPI for one of their banners over the Nikon booth. And I knew that was really important to me. And I wanted to come up with something that was unique and beautiful and also present a couple of different options. But what I ended up finding out was that I just didn't imagine how a color grade beyond what I had come up with could be possible. And what I mean by that is I came up with a color grade and I wanted to present other options, but I was so in love with the color grade that I did and I was attached to it. I already had my biases because when we do something and we put our time into it, sometimes we have the biases that go with it. And I was unable to detach myself and I could recognize it. I was not able to come up with another color grade or three other color grades for that matter that I was happy with. And I said, what am I going to do? And then it hit me. I had all these other PSD files for different commercial and editorial jobs that I already had done work with. So I pulled from that and I used those layers on that work and I slightly tweaked it and I came up with different options. And sure enough, I think the option that actually won wasn't the one that I did from scratch. It was the one that was from some other image that already was approved by someone else that I had tweaked. And so that got me thinking, well, if I could come up with a tool that pulls from different color grades, that would be kind of cool. And what would that look like? And then I realized something. Every single person that retouches or does any color work has a visual identity to their color grade. There's a particular look that they have and an identity. We all speak a particular language when you look at each other's photographs, and lighting plays a part into it, of course, but also post-processing does. And we can recognize a person's image off the bat when we see someone with a particular style.
Huh.
And I felt like I always had a particular style with my color work in the direction that I went to that people gravitate towards. And I said, let me actually look at those PSD files and my layers and see my preferences that I use. How far am I going with my curves? How far do I typically go with my selective color in these specific channels? You know, how far am I pushing my shadows, etc. And I found that I was using these 5 different adjustment layers, which you see on the panel interface, which is curves, color balance, selective color, gradient map, and color lookup, but less frequently color lookup. And I ended up writing down all the parameters that I typically wouldn't bypass with these tools. And then I worked with a coder to use a randomizer function where it would randomize these different layers on your layer stack. And so it would place all these different layers on a layer stack. And every time you hit create, it would adjust the parameters at random amounts, but without bypassing the blocks that I put in there. And those blocks, again, were based off of what I typically wouldn't go beyond. And I have, 3 different color intensities, which is light, medium, intense. So if you want to push it a little bit further or less or keep it subdued. And the reason I also have that is because you have different images where sometimes the image is shadow dominant, and sometimes if the same parameters might be too intense, well, you don't want it to be that intense. So we ended up actually pulling it back. So the tool was actually made for people to obviously apply color grades that are pleasing off the bat at an infinite number of possibilities, but it gives people ability to learn what they like and don't like. And I found myself actually using this tool to expedite the time I needed to come up with a particular color grade. And because it places all these layers non-destructively, if I don't like a particular layer, or if I feel like a setting is too much, I can easily modify it and add on it or tweak it. And with that process, I ended up learning a lot more about myself just through the programming of this application. And now people end up using this tool to either apply their own color grades to their photographs, or as a learning tool to figure out what they like about it, and also break down the color grades. Because once a color grade is applied, typically people don't know what's happening, but because the layers are there, they can go in, see the settings, and then tweak them. So that's kind of how infinite color is used, and why I also use it for my continuing work, as well as how it came to be.
So is this an app?
It is for Photoshop specifically. So it actually runs within Photoshop as well. So if I open up an image here of my friend Emily, and let me go ahead and close this tab out. If I go under Window, Extensions, and Infinite Color, this is an application that opens up in Photoshop directly. And if I decide to, say, use light as my setting and create, it ends up creating a particular color grade for this image. And as you can see here, it's not too intense, but sometimes what happens is you don't really need an intense amount of color for the look that you're going for. And this look, for example, decreases the saturation in the highlights. It cools it down a little bit. It adds a little bit more contrast and pop. And if you keep hitting create, it ends up coming up with different color grades every time you work on a photograph.
Huh? All right, where do you get this? From you?
Yeah, you can go to the website here at infinitecolorpanel.com, and it'll have the option here to purchase on the website. And also, before you're able to do so, there's different sections here that tell you how it works, but also there's a tutorial section in case people want different ideas into the different ways they can use it. And it's interesting because we've found multiple ways of using it as is, but also seeing how the community is using it too. And we ended up setting up a Facebook group as well for Infinite Color so people can share their work, and we feature people on a regular basis too.
So is this like a bunch of presets that go on forever?
No, actually, there's no preset at all. These are
Well, what I meant to say, it's like a preset.
Oh yes,
like a
yes.
preset that goes on forever, but the initial, let's call it setting, is based on the color of the image that you currently have on the screen.
Correct, exactly. And here's a really good example of that. If I go ahead and let me see here. Let me
And
set
is it
up
all
something.
based on algorithms?
It is. It's actually based on, it's scripted. So what happens is, for example, let's take a look at the gradient map over here. Every time I hit create, it comes up with a different gradient map altogether. So it definitely cycles through all the potential options, and it's only going to be capped at whatever it's programmed to do so. So for example, curves, you'll never get a curve that goes like this or like this, because traditionally that will never look good on most photos. So we did a lot of extensive studying to figure out how far we should take each variable, because if a single variable is out of place, the results end up looking pretty heinous.
But does that preclude you from pushing the envelope?
No.
So you can.
You can go in manually and adjust these things afterwards.
Yeah. So if you feel that it wasn't enough at a particular amount, you can then go within the curves, for example, and then manually override whatever it is that you are also going for.
In order to get this, would I have to remortgage my home?
No, it's currently around, I think, $80 or so.
US?
US.
Yeah, Pratik's in Texas. You can't tell from his accent.
So
I
much,
forgot my hat. I'm sorry.
so much for right out of the camera, huh?
No shit, man. Oh man.
So, question, if I may,
Price
on
online is
Yeah,
how
what
you
please,
actually
Daniel.
use this. Pardon me?
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, no, one question on your actual use of this. I can see if I were to use it, I'd like that first attempt on this model. I thought it actually looked quite good, better than all the rest. I imagine you can use the undo function to go back. But real world, how do you actually use it? You just,
How do you know when to stop?
yeah, how do you know when to stop? And if you think, hey, that's good, and you tried 5 more, and oh, hey, that's pretty good. Do you make duplicate images, and then you go back and compare the 3 favorites? Just very briefly, how do you
That's
how
a
do you
great
choose?
question.
When do you stop?
So this, the good news is, fortunately, there's a lot. You'll end up finding more than one that you end up actually liking, and that was a good testament, because I was very worried that I would find nothing. And it's also very common that you'll do 20 but find maybe 1 or 2, and that's very typical, because obviously color is so vast where you shouldn't find something that you like every single roll. And what I tell people, and what I do personally, is because I'm not very good with decisions, sometimes what happens is whenever I find the first thing that I like, I stop. And then I say, this is going to be the one. And I commit to it. But if you're curious, what you could do is do a few of them and then go back as well, because the Command Z function is also programmed to go back to the last look that it creates. And this is very important, because when you think about it, in Photoshop, what happens is that if you say add a curve, add levels, or add another curve, add levels, etc., Command Z is only meant to go back and undo the last thing that it added. So traditionally, if Photoshop adds 5 different layers and then it adds another 5 different layers, the Command Z should have only taken away 1 layer at a time. But because of the script itself, we were able to make it so that when you hit Command Z, it goes back to the last look that it generated. So for example, let me just increase the intensity to medium, which I highly recommend not doing for most cases. I typically prefer light. Medium and intense are for images that typically have a lot more highlights and there's not a ton of shadows, or people who are more creatively inspired by color than, say, people who want to keep it really subtle and minimal. But I'm keeping it to keeping it to medium, so you can see what happens when I hit create a few times and hit Command Z a few times.
How often do you, I can't think of the word, when we put the thing onto our monitor and we
Color calibrator?
how often do you color calibrate?
I would say roughly once every month or so.
That's it?
Yeah, and also depends on the monitor. At home, I'm using a NEC PA272W, and they make the names really easily memorable. But it's a high gamut 98% Adobe RGB monitor, and it's a LED backlit monitor. The previous ones, I had the NEC 269, which was it was an LCD monitor, and it was very slow to warm up, and it just did not retain the accuracy for as long. But with the new one, I'm able to keep it quite accurate for much longer periods of time.
And you're able to keep that color accurate for a month?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
In the infinite color when you're, let's say you have a series of 5 images,
Mhm.
and you find the setting in infinite color that you particularly like on the first one, like this one, and you want to apply it to the others, how do you do that?
There's
Okay.
2 different ways to do that. Number one is under the, let's see here, under window and libraries. Where did libraries go? Here we go. Under libraries, you're actually able to save color grades in libraries. So for example, if I just name this, let's name this John. And if I bring John over to my library here, it saves as a preset, so to speak. And then what I could also do is if I, let's say I delete this, for example, pretending this is another image. If I have a fresh image where I want to apply it to, I can right click on it and then just say place layers. And then what happens is it places all those layers on any particular image that you want. So you can save a particular library of different color grades, just like actions. A second way is there is a free script that you can apply the color grades to multiple images. I'm trying to find where that was. Here it is. There's this video here on the education tab on the website. And even if you buy this or not, it doesn't matter. You can still use it. There's a link in the video to a free script, which installs really easily into Photoshop. And what you do is once the script is installed, and I don't have it installed on this machine, but once you have multiple images open, you can hit the button and it applies that to everything else that's open within Photoshop too. So you can do it automatically or manually.
So let me ask about a 2 or 3 week question from this.
Sure.
You know that Apple is about to launch their M1.
Well, some of them are out there, the laptops.
Yeah.
Will this application work on the new Apple system?
Yes. And so there's two ways about it. So Apple released the M1 and Adobe currently is working with them to create, their future updates. And what we do actually in the backend is our company basically now is called Infinite Tools, which we have other sets of tools as well. And I'll talk about it in a minute, but we are porting over all of our plugins to make sure that they are working with the future versions of Photoshop, especially because right now, the people who have M1, they can download Photoshop CC and their current plugins will work. But in the future, the technology, they're going towards another architecture called UXP. And UXP is a little bit different than how current panels operate and work. And so we're just making sure that once it becomes strictly just UXP, for example, in the future, that everything that we have now can work with their ecosystem.
I don't know. These are all just Photoshop because someone was asking if any of this stuff would work with Affinity Photo.
No, currently not, because the Affinity Photo plugins architecture is not the same as Photoshop's extension architecture. So, and Affinity doesn't have a large enough user base yet to justify the ability to redo everything for just Affinity. But in the future, it will, just because the way that we are intending to recode everything is going to be accessible throughout a multi-platform approach.
Hey, John, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Where the hell did you find this guy? This guy is just incredible.
Thanks.
Don't let go of him.
No, I've known Pratik for a while.
And one other thing is I find his manner of speaking similar to mine. No. Just impeccable. Very well done. You a very good lecturer, a very good speaker.
Yeah, and his
Thank you.
wife's a great retoucher too.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's interesting, John. So
Yeah.
I met John back in Creative Live when I had my first class there,
Are we supposed to
and
apologize for that? Uh,
John was great. He works in the background and everything works perfectly, and it's great.
where did you get your background from? I mean, where's your background?
My background was actually in hotel management in
Oh,
college.
that's an interesting segue.
Yeah, I did hotel management, and let me stop the screen share for just a second.
Yeah.
I did hotel management, and I also did marketing as well for my college degree, major and minor. And I actually was a horrible student in the sense that I learned really slowly through the course of everything, and I just could never grasp the things that teachers would talk about until I went back and studied it myself over and over again. So the same thing happened with photography, where once I got into it and people were lecturing about different concepts, I just had to go and practice it myself and figure out how to understand it from my thinking. And I realized that a lot of people had the same thought process, where they really needed to slow down and break it down really slowly in order for them to grasp something and then apply it and then go on. And I always got stuck because people would talk about concepts, and I was still figuring out the first part of the concept, and then they would jump to the second part of the concept and I was already lost. So I said, you know what, I really should just apply the same thing to Photoshop, where we take it a step at a time, talk about a layer, and make sure that their face is telling me that they got it, not that they're telling me that they got it, because their face always gives away the fact that they didn't understand something. And I just took that same philosophy of, if I could teach myself this thing and I felt comfortable explaining it to my older self, then I would feel comfortable talking about it. So in my head, every time I say something, I first ask myself, did that make sense? And then I continue on going forward.
You know, it just dawned on me. You did all this the same way that a doctor does.
Mm.
If a doctor wants to become a plastic surgeon, they first have to become a doctor. Understand the anatomy of the person's features.
Yeah.
You did it. You became a photographer to understand the mistakes that photographers all make, and then went the next step to become the plastic surgeon or the retoucher to correct those mistakes. That's a very interesting way of doing this, and I commend you.
Thank you so
For
much.
that. I very well done. And the images that you showed are magnificent. Did you do a lot of color studying research?
So my background before college, and I'll be honest, I didn't actually want to do my degree. It was something that was kind of the easy path out, because at 18, I'm 35 now, but at 18, I actually didn't want to go into hotel management, but my family actually owned a Best Western property at the time. And I was naturally thinking the progression was going to be taking over the business. And the rest of my family were all in medicine. And they all said, you should either be a doctor or a lawyer or, an architect or something that.
I had a feeling that there was something going on there that had to do with medicine. I really did.
The way that things were taught to me were very similar to how my family learned medicine. So it was definitely a path that was either subconsciously there and I was going to go into science actually, but I think the thing that detracted me from going into the science path was having a bad teacher. I had a really bad biology teacher in college, and it really detracted me from the passion I thought I had for it. And only after I finished school did I realize how much of a passion I had for human health and anatomy and everything related to the fields that I would probably get gone into. But what I found was that, now going back to the photography part, I knew that in order to be a retoucher, I had to actually understand photography, because there was no way that I was going to just be a retoucher and interpret how a photo should look if I had no concept of how skin changes under different properties of light. And so my background before the retouching was doing beauty photography. And I didn't really publish much of it because it was for personal study and was for understanding what part of our industry I liked the most. And when I realized that when I took photographs, I enjoyed dissecting them even more than shooting them, the path was kind of set for me. And it was also set for me because when I started to first market myself, it was the attention that I got from my work that I was posting and the lack of quality retouchers out there that also set my time forward. So it was a obsession, but also it was the demand that came from it too.
Do you work with anyone who is still shooting film, and do you find color grading from film more uniform in a series than it is in digital?
Great question. I don't work with anyone at the moment who. Oh, no, I take that back. We're doing a lot of stuff for Joe, with Joe McNally, who's primarily just giving us film scans, and there's a tremendous difference, especially when it comes to things like, excuse me, the granularity of the film that is not possible to really replicate in digital, especially the balance of the grit and the color noise, which is very different, I find personally, to anything that digital can create, because there's a sense of variation with film noise that I don't see in digital, no matter how much I try to replicate it. That is very interesting to me. I actually prefer working on film now more than ever, just because of that difference that it has and that character. And of course, because every film scan's different in terms of how it looks too. But the color grading is also different because with raw files, it changes based on the processor that you're working on. But these processors have a very unique look to them. Like when I process a raw file through Capture One, the way the algorithms are for interpreting the raw file have a unique look to it, where particular saturation levels might be a little bit higher for different skin tones. The contrast level out of the bat's different too. The way the noise and the shadow is interpreted is a very big giveaway for me as well. Camera Raw also has a different look altogether. And with film, it's also another level of complexity and difference based on how it was scanned and the overall look you get and the type of film used and if it was medium format or not, etc. And I don't see that as readily these days because less people are submitting film work. When it comes to the retouching part of film, I remember I was teaching at a photography camp a couple of years ago, and Ryan Muirhead was there teaching as well with film work. And he came to me and he told me, hey, listen, I know I have a question. And he asked me about how to retain a lot of the texture detail of his film work on his scans in Photoshop, because he found that a lot of the tools were blurring the texture and changing the texture variation and how the original grain was laid out across the file, especially when high contrast images, because the grain detail and the highlights were so different than the midtones and the shadows. And he was like, what's going on? How can I fix this? So we had to take a little bit more of a surgical approach. But the best part I liked about the experience was that the techniques we use with ensuring the right healing settings were used on the healing brush, or the clone brush had the right settings and processes still applied from digital to film, which was a really good testament to say that the techniques we use in high-end retouching through Photoshop still applies today and in the past, whether you're bringing back film scans or not. The color grading also is very different because, again, the underlying information is so unique, where the color grading plays a big difference, and it's really hard to make things a little bit more uniform than it is a digital file. So I hope that answered your question.
It does. And let me also ask, I have a personal preference for the color palette produced out of Hasselblad Digital and Leica Digital. Do you see a difference in color palettes produced by different camera systems?
Yeah, actually, You know what? There's a photographer in Spain that I had the opportunity to teach with. I'm going to pull up his work really quick if I can find it. Give me just one moment. This is a good example of this question here, and it's worth the wait. But it's true. I think many of us do have such a bad time with particular classes that sway our future, where when you look back at it, you wonder what would have happened if we didn't have so and so, or if our influences change, which is why I'm such a huge proponent for education now more than ever. And I'm such an introvert because I just wanted to retouch, but people kept asking me to teach. So I said, if it is something that can be worthwhile and useful, that changes people's course of life and direction, then it's worth putting time into, considering what knowledge I had with my own past. This photographer, Eugenio Ruquenco, he's in Spain, and he teaches at the School of FD, which is one of my favorite schools across the world. Phenomenal photography.
Could you put the link in the chat for folks?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So he, how do I go back to my chat here?
Oh, you can do it after we show it.
Okay, cool. He's actually somebody that I highly admire for his variety of work and his personal projects. So he has a phenomenal variety, but he's known for this type of work where he primarily shoots on a Hasselblad, and I think it's either H3D or H2D, and I got to go to Spain with Wacom, where Wacom had Eugenio shoot the first day, and I was retouching the second day, and we were at his warehouse in Spain, and they built an entire set for him. Well, not they, but he had a full team. He had a vision in mind where he would build a full set like this with different walls. And a lot of his famous work that most people know him for is this series where he shoots in a room which has an open face that he shoots into, and everything is done with either hot lights, with like RE lights, or flash. And he would build elaborate sets. This one's very simple, and he's changed his website since I last been here. But like even the banner image is done in a similar way. And I learned something interesting that day. He would shoot all this on a Hasselblad, but he would run the Hasselblad files through Lightroom rather than Focus. And for those of you who are not familiar with using the Hasselblad digital format system, is that they use the Focus processor for their raw files pretty much. And I asked him why he didn't use Focus, because for me, I'm thinking, if you have Hasselblad, use Focus. You have Capture One, use Phase One or other files, or Camera. And he used Camera for his Hasselblad files. And they were noticeably very different. And he told me that he liked the look of it the most. He found it the most pleasing in comparison, for no other reason. Obviously, the shadows didn't hold up the same as Focus did. So technically, it wasn't the better decision, but artistically, for him, it was the better decision. And I always remember that, because that combination of software and hardware was his artistic palette for his color grade. And that was before any color grading at all. And I was shocked to find out that a lot of his work didn't have much color grading to it. That was his identity, that combination. Of course, obviously, as a part of it comes the decisions that we talked about with the color palette, with the clothing and the light temperature and the objects and the textures used on set. But then when you broke down this image or similar images, this was pretty much out of the camera. So makes you realize that retouching shouldn't be an end to something that you're trying to replicate someone else's work, but you have to make these decisions very, very intentionally.
I'm going to ask something out loud, and maybe Ian would know the answer. Do the medium format digital cameras work with two different types of sensors, CCDs versus CMOS?
Hasselblad changed over, I think, from the last CCD was the H4D, which I have, and the next, I think they in the H5D they went to CMOS, and I assume it's the same with Phase One and their earlier models, and probably Leica. I think that Leica may. Now I'm going to retract that. I'm not sure if Leica started out CCD or CMOS in medium format.
No, they did. They all started out with CCD, and the one that the one that invented CMOS was Canon, and then they all went. Most of them went over to CMOS. But there is at least from my experience, a color difference between a CCD and the CMOS. Not only that, but the CCD had too much of a plastic look. It didn't have that roundness that CMOS or film has.
Actually, I've had this discussion many times with various reps and so forth who insist that it's entirely the same. I personally have always had an affinity for the files out of a CCD, just my personal preference. It's one of the reasons I've always kept my H4D, although I'd kind of like to go up to an H6D at this point for the video functions. But yeah, I happen to like that CCD look, and I think Leica in their very first, even Canon, the 1D was CCD, and I like that.
Yeah, the first two digital single lens reflex cameras.
Yeah,
both Nikon and Canon were CCD.
Yeah, the 1DS. Yeah, those. Yeah.
Well, I think we're getting a little off from the retouching and Pratik here, so let's bring it back there. There was a question earlier, Pratik. Is there any new Photoshop features that have changed your workflow? Any of the new tools?
But that's a good question. Also, you guys are right. The CCD backs were definitely my preferred files too, for sure. I don't believe that they're identical. I think that was just great marketing or trying to market people. The recent Photoshop tools, I honestly don't think. The select subject is pretty good. So Photoshop has a recent update for select subject. I haven't personally updated yet, for the sake of stability. But there's been a lot more bugs with the recent Photoshop versions that I don't want to mess around with just yet. But I did get to play with the the select subject updates, which they use more of their artificial intelligence for. That I think is really good, especially if you want to make quick cutouts of people. It does a really good job, and I've tried it across multiple images and situations. It sometimes still needs a little refining, but a lot better than where it came from. And if you're doing film work, After Effects has updates to like rotoscoping, which is auto-selecting, I think is worth looking into. I haven't played with it just yet, but from the videos that I've seen, that's also a much improved and welcomed advancement. Also in the recent versions of Photoshop, they have a neural filter gallery, which is basically their new set of filters that are using Adobe Sensei. And Adobe Sensei is like their artificial intelligence system or algorithm or whatever you want to call it. And they're using a lot of that now to deploy updates with their filters off the bat. So even if you don't update, say, Photoshop, that algorithm and the artificial intelligence gets better in the background. So like even our company, like Infinite Tools, we use AI for different purposes. And things like automatically coloring black and white photographs is one that is quite popular, and it's relatively new as well. It's pretty decent. It'll get even better as time goes on and it learns. So it's feeding into the results that we are producing as well and learning from it, as well as giving us some pretty good starting results too. But aside from that, as retouching goes, I don't think there's a ton of other tools.
You don't use Replace Sky all the time?
Have you used any of the Topaz applications?
I'll be honest, I have not yet, but that was on my list to actually go through because they have released their the AI suite, the artificial intelligence suite of Remask, Sharpen, etc. How about you guys? Has anyone here used any of the recent Topaz tools, and how do you find them?
I've used most of them quite a bit, and one of the things I've found with the new Adobe Select Subject is, whereas I used to use Remask a lot, I'm now using Select Subject probably 85% of the time. As far as the other tools, the Sharpen AI, I find very good, but the Denoise AI I find excellent. And I end up using Denoise a lot more than I ever thought I would, even in high resolution images.
For wildlife, the gigapixel AI is amazing. I mean, I don't quite understand how you can take a picture and make it look better than the original when you make it 6 times bigger, but it does. And I mean, this tiger behind me, obviously I wasn't that close to him. But you can this, I didn't use it on, otherwise you wouldn't see noise in the eyes. But some of their stuff is really magical.
Have you had a chance to take that file that you upscaled to print, and how did it translate?
Better than Photoshop could have done it. I needed, I just won a 16 by 20 from ProCam on one of their online things. And I made the file in Photoshop, and then I upscaled it in Photoshop, and then I upscaled it in Gigapixel AI, and it's just tremendously better.
Wow.
It's sharper, it's cleaner, it's just, I don't know how they do that, but it's better.
That's phenomenal. I need to try it out, because obviously there are times where, you know, I have cropped images and I'm thinking, gosh, I wish I should have bought the EOS R5 or something, or the A7 IV or whatever, or the phase one. But then now it's nice to know that I can still upscale and retain that fidelity.
You know, I tried the same thing, and what they sent me was a case of vodka, and they said, drink it, it'll get better.
I want that company.
That's a good customer support.
Yeah, I'm only shooting with 24 megapixels. So with 24 megapixels, when you're trying to make, you know, 16 by 24 or 16 by 20 prints, and you need to crop a bit, Gigapixel AI is the way to go.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Have you seen this app called Remini, I think, for the iPhone?
No, I haven't.
It's an artificial intelligence thing that does. You upload your image to them, and it reprocesses to sharpen and things like that. And it's really quite interesting. What it seems to be doing is they must have a library of eyes and noses and teeth and things like that. And it kind of looks at your picture and picks something really close to it and puts it in place. So sometimes you get some really weird effects from it. But overall, it's pretty amazing looking.
I've ended up using the Topaz Denoise for both iPhone photos, and I have a camera I refer to as my toy camera. It's a Lumix FZ1000, which is not a bad camera. It's a 20 megapixel camera, but in low light it gets really noisy, and I end up shooting a lot of presentations in darkened theaters. And I run Denoise AI on those, and the results are just amazing.
Wow.
In fact, while we're talking, I'll look at one of the examples I've put together, and I'll share the screen as soon as I can find it.
Is that why
let me know when you're ready. I'll give you the permission.
Okay.
Is that why your nickname is Sarat?
That's what I feel like at times.
I remember when the sky replacement filter came out, it was such a and it still is a big topic of controversy, right? Because it's not your sky. I mean, it could be your sky, if you want to add it, but that's a whole other discussion.
When you did photography, did you shoot film, or are you a product of digital?
I was a product of digital. My first camera was the XTI,
Rebel.
The Rebel XTI. And then I went to the first 5D. And then now I'm on the EOS-R.
Yeah, Steven,
Okay, if
you can share.
okay.
I just moved to a place where we have fabulous skies. So I'm going to be doing a lot of sky replacement, and I'm going to be putting all these skies online for free because I don't need the money. It's going to be fun.
Okay, do you see this now?
Oh my goodness, that's a big difference.
Oh yes, it's huge. And there's also sharpening in Denoise. So that's the reason why Sharpen AI didn't do a whole lot to this, because Denoise already did so much to it. But this is with the Lumix FC1000, which is a nice little camera, but at high ISOs, it is just terrible as far as noise. But this produced a very usable image.
Can you go somewhere in between? I mean, it's almost, maybe it's because it's in so close, it's kind of a plasticky feel to it.
Oh, there are slider bars. You can choose anything you want.
Well, I used to worry.
This is a very small area. By the time you look at the whole print, the plasticky look goes away.
Sure.
I used to worry about which camera I was using, my full frame Nikon D750 or my crop sensor D500. And with Denoise, it's like, oh, never mind. I'll just use the 500. It's fine.
So other folks have any questions or comments they want to make, feel free to unmute and let us know.
This app that you have, the Infinity Color, I'm old school. I will tell you. It actually sort of, can you make a color wheel of the images?
So we have another tool. It's not infinite color, but the answer is no. It won't make a color wheel of the images per se. But we did have another color grading application, which works similarly. And I'm going to give. Let me see if I can if I have it installed here.
Can you give me the ability to share again for 1 second?
Oh,
sure.
Obviously a night shot.
Oh my gosh.
Now this was with a one of the Sonys, and I don't remember the model number. It was just at a demo night that I was using it. But this is from the top of Reunion Tower in downtown Dallas. Obviously 51,000 ISO. And yeah, it's just kind of amazing.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I even like how it kept the variation of the sky. Like you see some color variation.
Oh yes.
That's cool.
And it didn't destroy the spokes.
No.
Yeah.
No. And I other than running Denoise and Sharpen on it, I didn't do any other processing on this. That would have kind of destroyed the example.
How much is this blown up?
A lot. I'd have to go back and find the original image.
That's all right.
But this is a very small area.
I wonder if when they're going to start incorporating the AI within the camera itself. So, to produce like clean files off the bat at that high ISO without even.
Well, do you think they'd apply that to the RAW or just to the processed JPEGs?
Canon with their digital photo processor does apply AI denoise in DPP, but that's software on the computer. That's not on the phone, on the camera. But the phone manufacturers are beginning to do that. So I expect the camera manufacturers to do it. In fact, I would not be surprised with some of the latest cameras for firmware upgrades to start doing that.
Understand that the camera manufacturers, by the time they do what you're suggesting, let's hope that they're still in business.
I agree. Well, there's still things that you need dedicated cameras for that iPhones are not going to do a very good job for, like the tiger picture behind Stephen. I would not want to shoot that with an iPhone.
We have, as I mentioned, another company called Infinite Tools, and that's where our primarily of our new tools go to. And I'll do a screen share as well. There we go. So Infinite Tools itself has our updated products in terms of other things that we're developing and we're using in the future. And we have a couple of free ones as well. One of our free ones is our Infinite Extension Organizer. And basically that is very simple. It's just like if you have a lot of extensions or plugins in Photoshop, this will automatically arrange it for you in a window that stays open on your Photoshop interface. But that's only for the people who have like, different ones installed already. You don't have to have it. You don't have to have just Infinite products. They work for everything. But in terms of our workflow tools, we have one other color tool called Infinite Looks. Infinite Looks operates for color grading as well in Photoshop. And I'm going to jump to Photoshop to show you what that looks like. And you mentioned color wheels.
Yeah, look. Very
now,
nice.
So now some people prefer having a workflow where they have a physical and visual representation of how colors would look applied to the image before you apply them. And this is good for people who want a variety of results immediately. Sometimes this is a positive or negative thing. And in psychology, what happens is there's a term called temple fatigue, where, if you visit too many of the same temples across the day, and the same thing happens for colors, where if you see too many of them at once, it's overwhelming and everything becomes something that you're not excited about, which is why I still use Infinite Color more than this for color grading, because I want to see a result one at a time and then decide accordingly. However, the difference here is that, number one, you're presented with different colors in one go, but you have a couple of different sliders here. The sliders themselves are based on randomness. So if I decide that I would like a similar color palette to the one in the center, I could drag the randomness down here, and the colors that it generates are within a very similar color palette. Or if I decide to increase it, I can generate colors that are way different. And this is all done through AI as well. Like we sort colors and it analyzes it based on how similar or different they are. And it whittles it down into those two different sliders. The second slider here on the right-hand side is actually contrast. And the reason why we added contrast is if I decide to increase the contrast to maximum, it will also create a different level of contrast as well for each result that it randomizes. Or I can reduce the contrast to minimum to make sure that the contrast is exactly the same as the center. And then I can either add it to the image, I could, apply it, etc. So the way this is designed is that, say that you have all these results here generated across the spectrum. And if I decide that I would like this particular color grade to be the center focus, if I click on this one over here, it's going to add it to the middle. And then everything it generates around that is based off of the selection that I made. So if you then, for example, if you like this, but you want just a little bit of variation, I could reduce the randomness of the color. And then I get other colors that are similar to that color. And then if I want to apply it, I can then simply add it.
But the middle picture stays the same. The only thing that happens is the thumbnails around it change?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
And if I decide that I do not like these thumbnails and I want more options, I can just hit reshuffle, and then it will reshuffle around the middle. So the middle will stay the same. And only will it change if I decide that I want another one of these results to be the center focus. And then if I click on, say, this green one, then the green one comes in the middle, and then it generates the rest of the results around the middle based on the settings. So if I say, you know what, I want to keep that, but see other similar greenish tint images, it has that.
What happens if you use something other than a beauty or a fashion shop?
The same thing. I don't have a landscape shot on my laptop here at the moment, but it would be very similar where, because it works on it works as a LUT file. Let me see.
A lookup table?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it will look pretty similar. And I wish I downloaded one beforehand to show you, but it will do the same kind of thing where, it will analyze the center image and then create different variables based off of that. It also has a slider for skin tones. So if I decide that I want to protect skin tones, I could decide to use that slider and have that. And this is where the AI kind of analyzes what a skin tone is and isn't.
Oh, Dan here.
So there we go. And yeah, you can also save them as favorites as well. So if I decide that I like this particular one, I could just click on the heart and then it comes up here as favorite and they can rename it.
Let me ask the most famous question of all. Quando costa?
This one changes based on the location where you're actually browsed from. So this one's $139 for the actual extension. So which gets you everything that you are seeing here.
And
physically.
do any of these applications ever get bundled?
These do not get bundles. These will all be a la carte.
In case he doesn't mention it, I want to put in a little ad for him for the retouching series on the Portrait Masters.
Oh yes.
I think it's more important to learn how to retouch without all these extra. I mean, I'm sure the extra tools are wonderful, but I mean, I do both headshots and I do a lot of animal work. And it's amazing how the things I learned to do from the retouching series apply to everything else I do, from architecture to, I mean, the whole thing about how to set up a Wacom tablet or different brush tools or dodge and burn or liquify, all those things have helped me immensely. I mean, I'm a huge fan, by the way. So,
thank you.
The retouching series, it actually teaches you how to do all this stuff, I think is more important than the extra tools, because once you know how to do all these things, then moving on to, well, let's make it easier is a different story.
That's very true. And I'm glad you mentioned the part about how it applies to other aspects, because the techniques are all the same, but it's a matter of just understanding them. And if you notice, I didn't mention anything skin related yet in terms of retouching. So that is definitely something that also needs to be done. However, with the actual series itself, as I mentioned before, I'm a very slow learner. So I decided that instead of having a tutorial that's 6 hours long or something like that, it was easier to have it in little bite-sized videos where if you want to try and understand how to, say, reduce harder lines on the face, or if you're trying to, even out hair, or if there's like peach fuzz on a subject, how to remove that, things like that, where it's easily done in a bite-sized way. And also comes with I wouldn't say 100% beginner course, but it's a 3.5-hour little module here that goes through a lot of things that you need to know about how to set up like layers, or how to use a healing brush or a clone brush, or, using actions that come with the course as well that sets up the layers for you. So no matter kind of what level people are at, as long as you can open Photoshop, this should be a pretty well-encompassing course that you start with the fundamentals, and then you have very specific tutorials on the most common problems a lot of portrait photographers face. And then you also have at the end of all this stuff that is optional, might I add, that of course, if you need to know as you go forward in your progress and you come across these different problems, you can jump in and out. But at the end of this also has full retouches as well from start to finish, going over every single problem, but also compiled into a proper workflow. So you understand where the tools and techniques come into play.
Well, you'll put all this as a URL into the session.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so throw this into the chat. And Julie had a question about infinite looks. How destructive or non-destructive is it?
Okay, sure. Let me go and talk about that as well. With looks, the infinite looks itself, once you apply the color grade that you're looking for, it's actually quite non-destructive, where if I decide to, say, apply this little funky look here, to the panel or to my layer stack, it actually applies as one single layer. And this is also where Infinite Looks differs from Infinite Color, where you don't get the flexibility of individual layers, but you get it into one lookup table or one layer in Photoshop. So this way, you have the ability to apply it easily to more images with one layer. And it's also lighter as well as a file. And then, of course, you can adjust the opacity as needed too. So it's very non-destructive because it stays on top and it won't apply directly. It reminded me of the old Photoshop version where you had the ability to look through different color options as well, because it had something similar with their interface that they kind of got rid of.
Yeah, so throw the Portrait Masters retouching class URL into the chat,
Sure.
please.
There we go.
Did that help, Julie? Got the thumbs up.
I won't be rude. Thank you.
Oh, we get to hear that accent.
I know.
Where are you
Great
from,
to see
Julie?
everyone here again. I'm in Ireland. I am in County Cavan at the moment.
Ah, nice.
Yeah, so big fan. I've been following your work for a good while now, and I sort of joined the group last week. So everyone was so lovely, and they looked after me so well that I had to come back.
Oh,
Julie's
thank
actually
you.
going to be our guest here next Monday on the 28th.
Oh, exciting! What are we talking about next month? On the 20th next week.
I suppose it'd be my photographic journey, which
Nice.
in many ways it's sort of Creative Live and all those sort of series all have a big part to play. But yeah, we got into an interesting discussion last week about galleries and art and things like that. So yeah, it'll be just, I suppose, me talking about what I'm doing here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, we're here almost 2 hours. So is anything else people want to talk about? Other questions, comments?
I'm on overload.
Good.
was hoping you were going to say you were speechless.
No.
So Pratik, how is this?
Never,
I guess
never.
the big question comes down to how has this past year been with the whole COVID thing? How have you dealt with that? As a retoucher, you probably don't have to. You're not missing the photographic side like some of us are.
It's been interesting. We had to cancel a lot of travel plans. I think that was the biggest thing for us. We were supposed to actually go to Ireland this year too. We were supposed to go to Bali as well. I also do retreats, photo retreats and retouching retreats in different places, and that was part of a community building and just opportunities for photographers to get together. So that didn't happen. And but aside from that, it's been just focusing more on photography related stuff in a safe manner and producing content as well, and thinking of future tools and keeping up with just technologies that are coming out and integrating them and spending more time on that side of things, because when you're on the road and traveling, it's harder to pay attention to that. So just shifting around and refocusing on future developments, and seeing what can come of it. Because now that all these tools and technologies are here and growing faster than ever, it also presents opportunities to expand on that and take the tools that they're releasing and then make other tools or other processes easier to make, so that people can understand it better, they can use it better for their realistic results and real circumstances. But that's how it's shifted for me.
Where do you want to go with this as you get older?
More. So far, it's been a great year because Infinite Tools and Infinite Color is roughly, Infinite Color is around 3 years old, but Infinite Tools is only a year old. So we have a tremendous development team that I work with. I have a partner. His name is Stefan Kohler. He used to have a website called Raw Exchange in Germany, and it was the biggest German website for digital resources, whether it's textures and overlays or things that people can apply for composite work. So we actually collaborated together to make Infinite Tools happen. And so the products that we come up with, think about together, are things that we find are gaps within people's professional workflows for retouchers as well as photographers. And we want to continue pushing that because we have so many other great ideas now that AI is here, and ways that we can really work on it. I can't say much because it's really secretive, but it's really exciting. And so that's going to be feature.
Will you put that URL also?
Yeah, I just did under the retouching series content. I put that there too.
And he's out of Germany?
Yes.
Is his site still exist?
No, he ended up closing that down. And the reason for that is one of our other products is called Infinite Textures. And so we ended up actually taking his whole 10-year library and putting into Infinite Texture. And so you get actually commercial, you get everything cleared commercially. It's 100 and something as well, but you get it's over 10,000 plus high grade, high resolution textures that are shot in-house in a way where it can be applied to most images in most lighting circumstances, whether that's different overlays of like smoke or fog or light streaks or what have you, to things like digital backdrops, to clouds or whatever, skies, anything, light flares, pretty much anything that people typically use for compositing purposes. So that's one of our biggest products for like the international market for compositing and things like that. So that continues to grow as well. And people pay once, they get everything. It's better than buying like stock packs that are more expensive, like per pack. So that's how it started, and then we grew from there.
How about I'll call it textures of, let's say, a Monet, a Seurat, a Painterly? Does that come in this packet also? In the app also?
I don't think it has, say like paintings, for example.
Brush strokes.
I don't think so. Not yet. No. But that's a good idea, especially for bringing that in.
What city are you in?
I'm currently in Houston. Typically, I'm between Oxford, England, and Houston as well, because my wife is actually based in Oxford. She does fine art portraiture out there, and we actually met while she was still in England, and we're still doing our paperwork for her to come over here. And so in the meantime, because of all this, she's there, and I was just there for the last year.
I have a tip. My wife is from Czech Republic, and we asked for a visitor's visa, and they turned it down because they figured that she was going to come over here and marry me. So I had to just go over there and marry her. There was another type of visa that I should have asked for, and I'm trying to remember what it was. If you come up with it, Paul, I can send it to Pratik. Yeah, but I guess I need to ask though, what is Infinite Jokes?
So, the other, let me show you real quick. That was one we did for fun because we're actually both nerds, and so as you could have guessed, and so we have this Infinite Jokes panel, and what the Infinite Jokes panel is over the last, I would say maybe like 7 years, as a pastime, I have always posted Photoshop and photography related puns and jokes on Facebook. Always.
You actually have a pastime?
Yeah. That's my pastime.
Oh.
It's a lame pastime, but it is one nevertheless. And so what I found was that people actually kind of enjoyed that a lot. And so what we decided to do was that we wanted to make like a little platform within Photoshop where I inputted all the jokes that I had done over the last 7 years into it, and there were hundreds. And what happens is we combine that with a Siri-like voice, because now you can use AI to dictate in a very realistic manner text to speech instead of that robotic sounding text to speech. And so we combined that and put it in a little free panel. And so as you're working, it could tell you jokes, or it could like roast you, or it could judge your files as you're working.
Oh, wow.
I love it.
Oh,
Yeah. And the,
yeah.
and you can decide what tone of voice it has. So if you want it to be very judgmental and condescending, or very humorous, and you can also submit your own jokes as well that you can rate. So the best jokes end up actually being the ones that it says based on user input.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pratik. This has been really great.
Yeah, thank you
Wonderful.
so much.
Yeah.
Very.
If anyone wants to see that nice noisy shot in the full frame, I can put that on screen now.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'll put the original so you can remember what that looked like, and then where'd it go? This was the full frame.
Oh,
Wow.
Wow. Wow.
It was just an evening where Sony loaned a bunch of us cameras and we went out shooting. So this was just my curiosity to see what I could do handheld.
Whoa.
Crazy.
Can you go back to the 3?
To the original, the other one, sure. Hold on.
Mother jumper. Whoa.
Yeah, for this particular one, I probably would not have used Sharpen AI because the denoise was enough, especially since that's a very small part of the frame.
If you could, how would you, do you have any feedback in terms of how you would improve the functionality of denoise?
Well, there. Hold on a second. Let me load it. Let me get out of here for a second. Okay. There are 3 different ways to do denoise. It just does denoise. It does a clear, or it does something if you have especially low light. And there's also an auto you can click that will pick settings that it thinks are the best. And it also choose which of the modes it thinks are the best. There's also a toggle for whether it auto updates or not. Originally, it took a long time to update every time, so I always had it
I know
off.
there's Sharpen does.
Yeah, Sharpen takes longer than denoise,
Okay.
and it depends on which of the modes you use. But I don't know if you can see this. Well, let me make this more than 100. Let's make this 200%. Well, let's try 400%. Okay. So this is its automatic mode. But if I do a higher version of denoise, you can see that this gets a whole lot more smooth, takes a lot of the noise out.
Oh, wow.
But it also has a rastery look on the highlight of the glasses.
Yes, it definitely does.
And can you move it over to the nose?
Sure.
You see that kind of skin look along the bridge of along the
in the original?
On both of them. Look at the cartilage area of the nose on both. It has that kind of shrinkage factor, I call it. You see what I'm talking about?
But you look at the bottom part of the nose, where on the original it's obviously very noisy, and on the preview side it's much better defined. I don't know if that's where the actual border is, but that's where it's putting it.
And again, we're at 400% here.
Yeah, we're at 400%, and there
it's on a screen, not a print.
Right, and there are three modes and 4 sliders, so you have a lot of ability to move things around. Like if I go from denoise to AI clear, it's a much different look, and there it doesn't give you sliders; it just gives you choices. So this is low noise removal, then medium cleans it up a little bit more, high cleans it up even more, and then you can decide on high or low sharpness. So for something like this, high sharpness and lots of denoise works pretty well. Plus, if you want to recover details, you can always move that slider up.
What's the difference in AI clear and denoise AI? Is it the same thing? Like, is it just different algorithms, you think?
There are different algorithms. The clear works well if it's a pretty clean image, but you want to clean it up a little bit more. I wouldn't use that on a very noisy one because it doesn't do much. Denoise, because it has 4 sliders, gives you a lot more flexibility. So if I wanted, let's go back over to the eye because that shows noise a lot. But on here, if I wanted to go up to 100% denoise, this obviously gets very, very clear. And I can still increase the sharpness.
Oh, wow,
and
cool.
maybe move the original detail up. So by the here, when you move the original detail up, you tend to put noise back in.
Yeah, but it's so nice.
So you need to find a balance point. But looking at the difference between the two and remembering this is a big image and we're talking about just somebody's eyeball, this is pretty nice.
Yeah, tremendous.
Can you back down? Can you make it smaller?
Sure.
Slightly, not a lot.
We'll go to 200.
Yep.
And you're right, it does give it a more plasticky look. There's no question about that. But a lot of times what I'll do is I'll run this on a different layer and then back the opacity off on the layer so that I'll still get the underlying image, but mute over some of the noise.
Is this a RAW file or a TIFF?
Well, you can't work in RAW. I mean, it's turned it into a TIFF.
Okay.
But whether you're working in a TIFF or a PSD doesn't really make any difference. Okay. And it'll work on a JPEG. It's just that in a JPEG, you have a lot less flexibility. But if you're going to 100% here, which is more like what you're going to see it, this is a pretty clean image. It wasn't a bad image to begin with, but even the
look at the hair.
Yeah, even the things you were concerned about before, the plasticky look, you don't see that much of it when you're going to 100%. And most of the time, you're not going to be using it at 100% anyway.
Yeah.
So, if we back it off to 50%, which is more likely what you're going to be using at, give it a second to do its thing. I mean, this is a really nice look to it. And you're right that you end up getting more detail in the hair.
Yeah.
The
like
things
the badge.
The badges are really nice and sharp. And I do a lot of things with the Boy Scouts, so I'm always concerned that the badges are legible. And this does a great job on the badges.
Even clothing is cool too. Like the shirt collar.
Well, also both in Denoise AI and Sharpen AI, they have batch processing modes. So a lot of times if I've shot things with my Lumix FC1000 in some place that's dark and I know everything is noisy, I'll just load it all up in Lightroom, run in batch mode, and then go to sleep. And it'll go through whatever number of hundreds of images I've set it up, and I don't know how long it takes because it's done long before I get out of bed.
I can imagine you running around with like an f4 lens at pitch black going, yeah, I'll be fine.
I must admit, every time I click the shutter, I'm thinking about what it's going to look like after post-processing.
You're talking like a retoucher now.
Pre-visualization.
It's really good with organics, but with non-organic things, I mean, walls and the badges and all the other stuff, it's just amazing.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I have learned that if I make my photos small enough and step back a good distance, they'll be great.
Very cool. Well, I want to thank you all. I'm going to stop the Facebook share now. We're still recording here.
By the way, Topaz Labs office is about 4 or 5 miles from my house.
Oh, wow.
And it did go over, well, it not only is it 4 or 5 miles from my house, but it's about 100 feet north of the school where my kids went. So I knew exactly how to get there.
And you're in Dallas area?
And I'm in Dallas. And there was one day I went over and visited them for about 45 minutes. And they're really nice people. They have the first floor of the building they're on, and they have people sitting in front of computers doing their programming stuff. I don't know that I saw a camera anywhere in the place because they're all computer people.
Cool. Well, thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording now.